This is the web transcription service of the Royal Canadian Military Institute. On March the 7th, Dr. Alex Souchen of Wilfrid Laurier University spoke to Military History Night on the very little known but fascinating and frankly disquieting topic of the disposal of massive quantities of munitions at sea after World War II.
One of the aftermaths of war, when Britain was a veritable arsenal for the Allies, is the disposal of a vast quantity of unused and dangerous ammunition. Look out when you see one of these signs. Much of the ammunition is taken to sea for disposal. And once again, the faithful LST is on the job. Already 300,000 tons have hit the briny or have been blown up. But there still remains a gigantic stockpile of 800,000 tons to be liquidated. In the wake of war, Britain has one of the world's biggest house cleaning jobs.
Are you going to be all right? Are you going to be all right? Yeah. Hi, everyone. Can you hear me all perfectly? Perfect. All right. At 6:30 p.m. on the evening of July 18, 1945, a fire broke out on the south jetty of Canada's largest ammunition depot, the Bedford magazine in Halifax Harbour. The fire quickly spread to a nearby ammunition barge that exploded, and then up the hill towards other piles of shells temporarily stored nearby in the overcrowded stowage bunkers. Unable to contain the raging inferno, first responders and civilians alike evacuated, while a chain reaction of explosions continued for 24 hours, completely destroying the facility. In the end, this other Halifax explosion killed one person and injured dozens more, so it was nowhere near as large or devastating as the 1917 tragedy that leveled large parts of the city and killed almost 2,000 people. However, it was nonetheless an important turning point in the history of Canada's post-war demobilization. The causes and consequences of the disaster at Bedford really demonstrate the complexities involved in the process of ending war and making the transition to peace. The incident highlighted perhaps the most pressing issue facing the Canadian military once Germany was defeated. Victory precipitated a major crisis in logistics, transport, and storage, and the destruction of the Bedford depot only made the crisis worse. When the Second World War ended, the munitions and supplies accumulated to fight did not just simply vanish. Rather, they lived on in peacetime and continued occupying a physical space, regardless of their potential utility or obsolescence. And moreover, until their primary forms and functions were changed, the objects of war maintained the capability to fulfill their intended purposes, which in the case of ammunition and weapons was to kill, maim, and explode. And these types of assets posed a serious challenge to post-war political authority, public safety, and they also represented a continuing financial burden for demobilizing militaries and bureaucracies. Additionally, the mountains of captured enemy ordnance added further complexities to an emerging disposal problem, which I think is an underappreciated element of demobilization, stemming from the challenge of divesting surplus munitions and supplies when wars end. And today I'll be discussing one aspect of this disposal problem, the fate of Canada's surplus munitions and supplies. So what happened to all the bombs and bullets produced but never used in combat during the Second World War? Well, the short answer is they were thrown in the oceans. Ocean dumping was used by every belligerent country to discard surplus ordnance. It was by no means the only disposal method available, but drowning munitions was a favored option because it was seen as a reliable and efficient method. Pioneered a generation earlier in 1918, the practice was used to eliminate the remaining bulk of German and Japanese fighting potential and accommodate the rapid demobilization and disarmament plans of the Allies. Dumping also continued throughout the Cold War, as the arms race and military-industrial complex spawned new weapons systems that, in turn, necessitated a constant cycle of disposal for obsolete munitions. International agreements in the 1970s finally outlawed the practice, but the damage was already done. Although it is difficult to ascertain a grand total, scientists now believe that there are roughly hundreds of millions of tons of TNT, mustard agents, nerve gas, radiological waste, and other dangerous substances corroding away at the bottom of practically every single major body of water. From the Great Lakes and the Gulf of St. Lawrence to the Great Barrier Reef, Atlantic seaboard, the Pacific Ocean, and especially the Baltic Sea, underwater munitions threaten marine life, human security, and the offshore economy with toxic chemicals, carcinogens, and spontaneous explosions. Now, there are a lot of things to unpack about this particular topic, but today I'll try and answer some of the following questions. Why did the Allies dump so much ordnance in the oceans? What factors influenced policy making and implementation at the time? What is the history of Canada's dumping program? And what is the environmental history of disarmament? Hopefully, by the end of my talk, you'll gain a better sense of the context surrounding dumping operations, an appreciation for the difficulties involved in ending war and demobilizing, and a better understanding for the environmental legacies of war and peace. The origins of all Allied dumping programs started with the nature of wartime industrial production. Although Canada's productivity was dwarfed by the American and British and Soviet industrial fronts, its factories still churned out sizable amounts of material, and I've posted some of Canada's more notable production statistics here on the slide. And of note, Canada produced 72 million artillery shells and 4.4 billion rounds of ammunition, which was enough to theoretically shoot 2 bullets at every human alive on the planet in 1945. By contrast, the Americans produced a whopping 41 billion rounds of ammunition, and the British and Soviets each produced somewhere in between these Canadian and American totals. To put it mildly, we are talking about a phenomenal amount of firepower that doesn't even include what the Axis produced. Now, we also have to remember that not all of this firepower required disposal in 1945. Since large portions were expended in battle, a good chunk was needed for post-war requirements, and another good chunk was sold to allies like the Dutch or Chinese, who then reused it to fight other wars in the late 1940s. But whatever way you slice it, the leftovers were substantial. This then leads us to the first and most important contextual point in understanding why and how dumping transpired: storage space. The location where objects could be physically deposited became a major logistical quagmire when the war ended, not only in Canada, but especially in Britain and the United States. And to illustrate the point, consider the logistics of Canada's industrial war effort as water moving through a pipeline. When the valves at the war front were closed in May 1945, the water that had already entered the pipeline at one end backed up at the other, thus creating a growing reservoir of surplus munitions and supplies. The real problem, though, stemmed from the fact that this pipeline was designed to extract resources, manufacture munitions, and distribute goods overseas as quickly as possible, not hold them in prolonged and indefinite stasis. Throughout the war, the Departments of Munitions and Supply, or DMS, and National Defense, or DND, often resorted to constructing temporary buildings or leasing property to meet their expanding spatial needs. However, over the long term, and as demobilization hit full swing, this limited the locations where surplus assets could be stored or scrapped, as rental budgets were slashed, the munitions factories were dismantled or repurposed, the expertise returned to civilian life, and military bases closed down. Consequently, the assets occupying that temporary space needed somewhere else to go, and they were usually transferred into the custody of the government's disposal agency, the War Assets Corporation. Formed in 1943, the WAC was responsible for collecting, storing, appraising, maintaining, selling, and destroying all surplus assets. At its peak, it operated 6 million square feet of indoor storage space at 51 warehouses across the country, and in conjunction with the military, it also maintained several aircraft, vehicle, and ship boneyards, or places where larger weapon systems were stored until sold or scrapped. However, ammunition and explosives posed a separate challenge that an empire of temporary and rented facilities could not accommodate. To safely store bombs and bullets, they have to be placed in purpose-built magazines like those at Bedford. As a result, these specialized storage facilities became overcrowded choke points, and while this situation was not entirely unexpected, the amount of ordnance and the speed at which it piled up appears to have caught everyone off guard. We know that ammunition depots were dangerously overcrowded because of an investigation conducted by a committee of experts, chaired by Lieutenant Colonel G. Ogilvie, Director of Ammunition Filling in the DMS and Chairman of the WAC's Plant Decontamination Committee. Ogilvy published 2 reports on the Bedford disaster, one in August and the other in October. And the August report examined the causes of the explosion, but after interviewing witnesses and first responders, he could not definitively prove what caused the initial fire. However, the report concluded that the probable cause was careless smoking, in combination with an overcrowded depot, a large personnel turnover caused by demobilization, and a laxity in the enforcement of safety regulations. Ogilvy's report also included a set of before and after images showing the extent of the destruction. And within that lunar landscape of the after image, the 2 major craters are clearly visible, and they do not align with the bunkers from the before image, as you can see by those rough arrows there. So clearly personnel at Bedford were piling up ordnance wherever there was space available. Of course, this then begs the question, why weren't dumping operations taking place before July to solve the overcrowding? This question has some relevance because the practice of drowning, which was a technical term used at the time, received approval from the Privy Council in August of 1944 when PC 6099 was issued on the recommendation of the DMS. Additionally, the WAC had granted the military a special exemption for destroying unneeded ordnance without declaring it surplus through regular channels. Thus, from May 1944 onwards, the 3 services had a free hand to dispose of their lethal assets as they saw fit. Moreover, these arrangements also benefited the WAC because they relieved it of the necessity of constructing and operating new ammunition magazines. Instead, the WAC resorted to renting space for ammunition storage. And over the fiscal year of 1946-47, the WAC paid the Army nearly $780,000 for rent, but in the following year it paid only $22,000. And this steep drop in rental payments provides some indication that the peak of dumping spanned most of 1946. There are 2 general reasons why dumping wasn't taking place in order to cope with the storage crisis. The first has to do with the political interest at stake, and the second has to do with the mechanics of disposal operations. Over the spring and early summer of 1945, the military's post-war budget had yet to be established by Canada's political leaders. This meant that the DND was not only remobilizing to fight a war in the Pacific, but it was also fighting a war in Ottawa over its future size and shape. Since each service wanted the largest possible budget, it didn't make sense to suddenly and voluntarily relinquish large portions of their inventories. That was counterproductive to fighting the Japanese, and it was also counterproductive to legitimizing their sizable post-war budgetary demands. The services were able to drag their feet on commencing disposal operations because the European war ended so early in the 1945-46 fiscal year. In effect, federal departments had the funding to maintain their inventories while they strategized future requirements. This accounts for why March and April 1946, the end and beginning of the next fiscal year, were the peak months of surplus declarations. Obviously, all those declarations up there included more than just ordnance, but this gives you an indication of the larger problem here. The military's internal equipment appraisals and their political posturing placed abnormal strains on logistical capacities because all those objects and weapon systems had to be stored somewhere while budgets were finalized. The mechanics of disposal operations also contributed to the overcrowding. Since the WAC was unwilling to construct its own magazines, it piggybacked on the military's existing facilities, which meant that ordnance had to remain where it was because the WAC had nowhere else to put it. This compounded the situation in 2 ways. In the first case, because of international agreements with the Americans and British, all foreign-owned surpluses were declared through the WAC, and therefore the WAC came into possession of leftover American and British ordnance in Canada that it had to transfer into Canadian depots. And in fact, according to the correspondence of the Director of Naval Ordnance, a large portion of what exploded at Bedford was later identified as British in origin. Secondly, since the WAC's primary mission was to recoup as much money as possible from the sale of surpluses, it required the time to find potential clients, particularly since some munitions had useful civilian applications in the mining industry or highway construction. And therefore, even if ordnance was surplus, the shipping capacity if the shipping capacity was available, dumping couldn't take place until potential sales were ruled out. However, in the wake of several accidental deaths involving souvenir firearms and the Bedford explosion, this selling priority was later removed in reference to lethal assets in November of 1945, And when coupled with the military's severely truncated post-war budget, this set the stage for a significant disposal program. Aside from selling munitions to police forces or other allied governments, there was a limited range of disposal methods that were available at the time. These other methods included abandonment, open-air burning, controlled detonations, scrapping, and ocean dumping. Thus, dumping was neither a foregone conclusion nor the only available alternative used to destroy leftover ordnance. In fact, no single method could handle the entire volume requiring disposal around the world, though dumping emerged as a favored option because the other alternatives available had various flaws that made them less reliable and efficient. In reference to conventional and chemical weapons, the least preferable method was abandonment, because this usually meant that ordnance was left behind or buried, which may have cut costs in the short term, but it did not eliminate the threat of recovery by subversive or criminal elements. Open-air burning was used frequently, especially in order to destroy enemy weapon systems like combat aircraft. But as you can imagine, burning explosives and chemical weapons created toxic smoke, which endangered technicians and prompted public complaints about air pollution. Therefore, open-air burning, which by the way still happens today in the US as evidenced by the picture there at the lower right, was limited to isolated areas or heavily polluted regions, and also by the types and quantities of munitions requiring disposal, right? It didn't always make sense to burn large amounts of explosive compounds. Closely related to open-air burning was controlled detonations. Like with incineration, large and small detonations were used frequently and depending on the local logistical circumstances. Perhaps the most famous example I can share with you is the British Bang, which took place on Heligoland Island in the North Sea. In April 1947, the Royal Navy placed roughly 7,000 tons of surplus explosives inside the German submarine pens located there. The Navy's goal was to destroy the pens, but the resulting explosion was so big, it altered the island's ecosystem and landscape. Additionally, such a large explosion in a relatively remote part of the world should demonstrate the critical flaw of this disposal method and also answer a question that I'm frequently asked. Why didn't they just blow up everything? Well, they couldn't do that because the logistics involved were too costly and extensive. Remember, disposal is only profitable if it takes place through pre-existing transportation and storage infrastructures. At Heligoland Island, the logistics were justified for strategic reasons, yet the detonation was one of the largest non-nuclear explosions in history, and all we're doing is talking about a measly 7,000 tons of surplus TNT. That's a fairly small amount, particularly in reference to all the leftover ordnance around the world. So controlled detonations were limited by the buildup before the blast and the explosion's yield. Scrapping was another common disposal method and probably the most preferred option because it allowed for the salvaging of metals and other materials which could be reused or resold. Remember, in the 1940s, Depression-era thrift still heavily influenced human behavior, so deploying manpower and resources to the tedious and dangerous task of breaking down shells was viewed as important by policymakers and the general public. There are many recorded instances, after both World Wars in fact, when ordnance was scrapped. For instance, the French company Piquet et Fils, which was contracted to dispose of British munitions in France in the 1920s, had at least 9 accidental explosions at just one of its demilitarization facilities, which killed 2 workers and significantly injured 7 others. In another case, following the Second World War, a steel shortage gripped Canada and prompted the government's steel controller to order the WAC not to dump a batch of 79,000 7.2-inch shells, and instead sent them to Canadian Arsenals Limited, a Crown company established to run the post-war munitions industry. At Canadian Arsenals, the shells were boiled to remove the explosive compounds, and the casings were then melted down. According to the WAC's annual report, 5,600 tons of metal were recovered for less than the cost of dumping. However, the key limiting factor here was capacity. Canadian Arsenals was the only place in Canada where this could be done safely on a profitable scale, while the rudimentary demilitarization facilities located closer to the front have left a startlingly toxic legacy. In 2015, the French government started paying farmers near Verdun not to grow crops on land where shells had been scrapped after the First World War. This decision was made in light of a scientific study that found explosive compounds and other carcinogens in the crops of barley, wheat, and the milk of cows that ate the grass. In other words, the most contaminated places on the Western Front aren't where the fighting was heaviest, but where the cleanup was concentrated. I think it's pretty clear that every disposal method was imperfect, but no alternative offered the same level of efficiency, speed, and reliability as ocean dumping. So I think it's best to consider dumping as a pressure release. In the context of decreasing post-war budgets, limited storage space, the object's dangerous nature, and the events like Bedford heightened concerns for public safety, it's not that difficult to understand why officials wanted an efficient and reliable solution. Since the disposal of ammunition and explosives requires both a location of deposit and a suitable destruction method, contemporaries defined efficiency and reliability by judging how well those two requirements were combined. In other words, disposal was most efficient and reliable if the location where ordnance was placed was the destruction method. The oceans fit the bill. The Allies had the available ships, the ocean floor had an indefinite storage capacity, the water acted as a security perimeter, bulk quantities could be disposed of quickly, and as long as the weather cooperated, dumping could continue without interruption and far away from prying eyes. It is important to understand here that dumping was a conscious choice, repeated over time, and not some rushed or makeshift strategy. Therefore, government and military officials were not ignorant of their actions, and nor were they aloof to the environmental consequences. In fact, the warning signs were apparent almost immediately following the first ever dumping operations conducted by the British in 1919 at Black Deep, an ocean trench located on the northern edge of the Thames estuary. The fact that officials chose Black Deep is telling because it had been used as a dumping ground in the 19th century for harbor dredgings and other hazardous waste. So for officials, it wasn't much of a stretch to dump more pollution in a place that was already heavily contaminated. However, in the wake of these test dumps, reports of an unusually large die-off of oysters along the estuary's southern shores started surfacing. According to one local company records, between 17 and 92% of every single oyster bed was dead by September 1920, and the oysters were all covered in these cancerous black lesions. British merchants were quick to blame the dumped TNT, and some even reported finding artillery shells in their oyster beds. As a result, the British government commissioned Dr. J.H. Orton and the Marine Biology Association to investigate, but Orton's findings could not definitively attribute the lesions to the dumped TNT. This incident was, in effect, a turning point in the history of underwater munitions because it established an important precedent in military and government circles. Since Dr. Orton's findings were inconclusive, other scientific knowledge about the ocean's dilution powers prevailed. Basically, officials understood that munitions were pollutants, but they believed they could mitigate the dangers by dumping munitions according to certain regulations and techniques that adhered to the water's capacity for dilution. As other scholars have shown, in the first half of the 20th century, a permissive attitude towards the dumping of garbage and waste was commonplace. This attitude was based on the idea of threshold values, to borrow the term from Jacob Hamblin's work, which held that there was a maximum amount of pollution that could be introduced into water without affecting human health. However arbitrary or inaccurate, the belief in large dilution thresholds negated concerns about the environmental consequences. In other words, if officials could regulate the amount dumped at one time or in one place, then the total amount didn't matter because the water would dissolve or disperse the pollutants in between each dosage. Following that logic then, any environmental indicators like dead or discolored fish could be dismissed as temporary or the result of imperfect dumping methods, thereby allowing the practice to continue indefinitely. Whether or not this feedback loop was intentionally or unintentionally created is difficult to determine from the archival evidence, but its duplication spanned multiple decades and crossed international borders. In Canada's case, officials were aware of the environmental impacts and dangerous nature of dumping, but showed very little concern for the long-term ramifications. So far, I found precisely one reference to the impact of dumping on the salmon fisheries in the Gaspé Peninsula, while no environmental groups or coastal communities were canvassed for their input, even though military officials thought to consult with communication companies operating undersea cables. However, I must point out here that I have not been granted full access to all government records, so it's possible that officials had more to say about the environmental impact. Further inquiry into this subject will have to await my Freedom of Information request with the DND. Currently, the DND is over a year delinquent, even though they are legally required to deliver the information within 30 days. The lack of government transparency on this issue is a major obstacle for future research, so keep that in mind as I explain the scope of dumping and its environmental legacy. Now, despite my issues with access to information, there is a sizable trove of records available at the Library and Archives Canada, and these documents have allowed me to reconstruct a detailed account of Canada's post-war dumping program. According to an inventory submitted by the naval officer in charge at Sydney, Nova Scotia in September 1945, it appears as though the whole program started in May. This inventory, the first page of which is on the right there, is significant because of it's the only comprehensive list available and therefore provides an indication of the scale of dumping immediately following the conclusion of hostilities. The inventory shows that a total of about 523,000 individual objects were jettisoned from ships leaving the port from May to August. This included over 250,000 cartridges of 303-inch ammunition, over 100,000 cartridges of 20mm Ehrlichen rounds, nearly 20,000 cartridges of 2-pounder shells, 2,300 depth charges, and thousands of other projectiles divided into 53 categories. Throughout the fall of 1945, Canada's dumping program picked up speed, as evidenced by the weekly inventories remitted to Naval Headquarters, and I've posted a typical example here on the left. These records indicate that by October, the Navy was dumping about 500 tons a week along the Atlantic coast, and each ship involved dumped about 40 to 50 tons a day. Unfortunately, this was only the beginning, as these early totals likely increased throughout 1946 after post-war budgets were settled, making dumping one of the primary roles of the peacetime Navy. While the Navy did the lion's share of the dumping, the Army and Air Force also operated parallel dumping programs in the 1940s. Although documentation is virtually non-existent, we do know that in November of 1945, the Army dumped about 1,000 tons of obsolete ordnance in 78 fathoms of fresh water at Dyer Bay on Lake Huron, roughly 2 miles from the Bruce Peninsula and across the Georgian Bay from Parry Sound in Nobel, Ontario, where one of the largest explosives factories in the British Empire was located. Today, in the town named after the inventor of dynamite, Nobel residents are finally mobilizing to confront the contamination of munitions production and disposal and their possible connections to chronic illness, high cancer rates, and a potentially polluted water supply. So I think it's safe to say here that the Great Lakes and cottage country, places far, far, far away from the front lines, also bear the ecological scars of war and peace. As time went on, the types of assets dumped at sea diversified. In early 1946 and late 1947, the WAC paid the Navy and Army to dump Canada's stocks of chemical weapons, which amounted to roughly 3,000 tons of mustard gas, south of Sable Island on the Atlantic coast and off the continental shelf somewhere along the BC coast. The methods used for dumping chemical munitions differed from conventional ordnance in that the chemical agents were packed into drums and then packed onto a surplus landing ship and towed out to a designated set of coordinates where they were scuttled. However, today, these sunken ships are now emitting chemical plumes that can stretch 1 to 2 kilometers away from their actual locations. Furthermore, by the late 1950s, the Canadian Navy was regularly dumping radioactive materials. An really sad and terrifying story, throughout most of the Cold War, both sides of the Iron Curtain dumped and discharged radioactive waste into the world's oceans, rivers, and lakes at alarming rates. In Canada, the military standard disposal procedures directed service personnel to put the radioactive materials in leftover paint cans and encase them in concrete before dumping them into at least 1,000 fathoms of salt water. According to the 1960 dumping inventory, almost 25,000 pounds of radioactive material was thrown overboard and another 15,000 pounds were drowned in 1961. Now backtracking a little bit here, overseas in Europe, Canadian troops dumped at least 6 million tons of captured weapons and ammunition in the North Sea in July of 1945. And these munitions were largely confiscated from the Army's occupational zone in the Netherlands and the Emden-Wilhelmshaven area in northwest Germany. These types of operations were commonplace all over the world because leftover materiel posed a serious threat to occupational security. The Allies had to disarm Germany as quickly as possible, and the proximity of several ocean trenches in the Baltic Sea and Skagerrak Strait were used to dump Germany's conventional and chemical munitions. Definitive totals are difficult to provide, but one account stated that about 750,000 tons of chemical weapons were dumped into European waters after World War II. Conventional munitions like TNT or small arms ammunition are more difficult to estimate because we know less about them, but an educated guess might quadruple the chemical weapons total. In Asia and the Pacific, dumping operations were widespread, not only because the US had no intention of funding a costly repatriation program, but also because the Japanese military had stockpiled a great deal of munitions in expectations of Operation Olympic and Coronet, the code names for the two American amphibious assaults on the Japanese home islands. And by the way, both of those amphibious assaults were set to be bigger than D-Day. Consequently, by November of 1945, the Americans were dumping an astounding 4,500 tons a day from the 10 operational ports along the southern coast of Kyushu. Given this international context, dumping in Canadian waters was modest by comparison, but it was not without significant ramifications for Canadians and their coastal environments, and nor was it an exceedingly small program either. In fact, Canadian officials soon realized that they needed to impose some type of regulatory framework, or else dumping was liable to get out of hand. And in line with these ideas about threshold values, military officials identified several locations in the Maritimes as suitable dump sites in mid-September 1945. At these designated locations, which I've identified here on the map, dumping was retroactively authorized to take place in a 5 nautical mile radius. However, we would be quite naive to think that just because a set of designated coordinates were established on paper, that ordnance ended up in perfect piles on the seabed, exactly where they were supposed to be. At the time, dumping was an inexact science, and it was replete with many challenges, the least of which was to correctly navigate a ship to those locations. In the mid-20th century, navigational technologies were terribly imprecise, so it's highly probable that captains thought they were in the right place, but actually they were dumping in the wrong spot. Additionally, the ships never dropped anchor, which meant that they stayed in constant motion while crews jettisoned conventional ordnance by hand. As a result, ships traversed the 5 nautical mile radius multiple times, dropping ordnance in different patterns and concentrations. Moreover, dumping was also a labor-intensive process, so it could take several hours to complete one voyage. This incentivized an early start in order to avoid navigating at night or paying costly overtime wages, so crews often started while the ship was en route to the dump site, which created debris trails following the ship's course. In the end, conventional munitions were jettisoned over a wide and undocumented area. Terence Long, chairman of the International Dialogue on Underwater Munitions, which commissioned this second map here, estimates that there are more than 3,000 dump sites in the Maritimes alone, and the DND publicly recognizes only about 1,000. This discrepancy is significant because the underwater munitions carry real environmental and human health risks. Just consider for a moment those colored blocks at the bottom of the map. They are areas, as of 2005, that were approved for oil and gas exploration. I don't think you need to be a rocket scientist here to figure out that underwater munitions pose a significant energetic threat to oil rigs drilling into a seabed blanketed by an unknown quantity of explosives. And this problem is compounded by the fact that most people don't realize how extensive dumping was or consider the dangers as seriously as they should. For instance, when the oil company Shell started its exploratory drilling in the Shelburne Basin in 2015, a place where ordnance was likely dumped off the southeastern coast of Nova Scotia, they funded a one-day survey for munitions. Fortunately, Shell has since discontinued its exploratory drilling, but the dangers remain in other places around the world, like Beaufort's Dyke, for instance, a deep ocean trench in the Irish Sea and the UK's largest disposal grounds. In 1945, the RAF, just one branch of Britain's armed forces, was dumping 500 tons a day in Beaufort's Dyke. And today there's somewhere between 1 and 2 million tons of ordnance located there. In the 1990s, a British gas subsidiary, Premier Transco, built a controversial pipeline bisecting the northern edge of the dump site, and despite the fact that that seismic instruments later recorded over 40 spontaneous explosions in a 10-year study. Beyond the damage to infrastructure, the energetic threat also extends to unsuspecting beachcombers when munitions or clumps of mustard agents wash ashore, though fishermen are the most at risk, as bombs and drums of chemical weapons can get trapped in their nets. In fact, if you're a fisherman working in the Baltic Sea, you're almost guaranteed to be gassed at one point in time in your career. The threats to human health also exist on a microscopic level. Recent scientific studies have found that corroded chemical and conventional weapons are leaching harmful derivative products and carcinogens into marine environments and the food chain. The risk is relatively low, except if you repeatedly consume fish harvested from dump sites, then you're more susceptible to chronic illness and cancer. Meanwhile, the high amounts of dumped TNT, which is an incredibly carcinogenic substance, may account for the cancerous tumors and low reproductive capabilities in some fish species around the world. Scientists are divided on the long-term implications of further corrosion. Some believe that a time bomb is sitting on the seabed, and since it takes about 100 years for salt water to corrode through shell casings, they're expecting some mega release to occur in the next half-century. Other scientists are a little more cautious and believe that a mega release is unlikely since corrosion rates can't account for all local conditions, while the water's dilution powers will continue dispersing pollutants at current rates. Colleagues have nicknamed these the ticking time bomb and the unicorns and rainbows approaches, but the reality is probably somewhere in between. However, I think we can all agree here that such uncertainties and discrepancies and dangers justify further monitoring operations and historical research, as well as more investments in remediation strategies, technologies, and especially food regulations. To conclude, when discussing the impact of warfare on the environment, historians need to consider more than just combat and mobilization. We need to think about the environmental costs of disarmament. When wars end, the violence doesn't just vanish. Rather, it accumulates in nature and harms at slower paces and in different ways. The pollution of peace is real, as the killing power of past wars was intentionally dumped at sea to eliminate the threat and liability, but decades later, these dangers still linger. In the 1940s, few people considered the long-term environmental implications. At the time, policymaking and implementation were constrained by the physical, the financial, and the spatial realities of a demobilizing military and government. The overriding priority was to divest assets quickly, reliably, and efficiently. Safety concerns were focused on accidental explosions at crowded ammunition depots, not the ecological consequences destined to arise after 100 years of saltwater corrosion. However, once underwater, these munitions fade from memory, but these tools of death and destruction, long considered destroyed or otherwise disposed of, are slowly returning and claiming more victims today. Thank you for listening.
The speaker will take questions. Anybody would like to offer one?
Yeah. I'm sorry.
Are there any programs being undertaken to go down where they know they've got a lot sitting on the bottom of the ocean, for example, and somehow or other exploding them or eliminating them?
Yes, there are some programs around the world. I don't know of any in Canada, though that, like I said, I'll have to await a Freedom of Information request because I do know that the Department of Defense is monitoring these sites as they should. But in other parts of the world, there are a number of programs that have been created, the most prominent of which is a NATO-funded project known as MODEM, which is an odd acronym because it doesn't reflect the title in any ways, but it's a program that is set up to monitor 3 major chemical weapons sites. And right now the project is about monitoring. So are these things impacting the environment? How can we gauge the impact? And the logic there is to gather information to potentially create a disposal or a destruction strategy later on. But there are a lot of problems involved in destroying it. As you said, going in and blowing them up is actually the worst thing you can probably do. It is actually right now what the Australian Navy does in the Solomon Islands. They'll go through, there's actually a really cool video online if you're interested in watching them. And it's actually the worst thing you can do because the underwater explosions are more deadly than above ground explosions. So yeah, exactly. So it kills fish in a large radius, and not all of the molecules are turned into energy. So that you're spreading pollutants over a wider area than would have been had you just left them there. So there's actually some major issues with actually going in and cleaning them up. And I actually learned some of these things at a NATO Science for Peace and Security workshop that I was at a few years ago. And I was like, well, why don't we just go in there and clean it up? You know, that's the right thing to do. And the one scientist stood up and said, well, we might be the bigger bull in a china shop, right? We might go in and cause more damage by cleaning them up, right, than just leaving them there and monitoring to make sure that we don't actually need to go in and clean them up. So I think that there's a wide set of opinions on this subject. There are many people who think that we should take the risk, do it, let's get this cleaned up because they're really dangerous. But then there are other people who are a little more cautious, saying, well, let's accumulate data and then eventually somewhere down the line we'll have enough critical mass to create a strategy for that. So right now, actually, the next where the funding's going next is to design decision-making programs and models for government officials. So when they discover a new dumping site, they have a set of policy alternatives that they can choose from, and given what they know in terms of the information, they can make their decisions. It's like a decision aid, essentially, is what they're designing now.
I'm probably one of the few people left who was actually involved in the fall of 1945. We went out with, I forget whether it was a destroyer Crescent or one of the frigates, with depth charges and shells out to the Halifax spoil ground and just dumped them over the side. That leads to first of all, the depth charge with no primer is not dangerous. You can't explode it. You put something alongside it, you probably could. But if the depth charge, the casing dissolves at some stage, rusts, steel, as it was amytal in those days, or most of them were, what's the danger of the thing just disintegrating and the amytal, how much danger is there in amytal? I mean, there would probably be, in our spoil ground, and the ships that were going out, maybe 1,000 depth charges or something like that. What is the actual danger from, say depth charge amytal?
So I'm not a chemist. I'm not going to make any bones about that, but I do believe that as amytal degrades, it gets less stable. So it is actually more likely to explode, and it can act, therefore, as a primer for TNT, which remains quite stable over its lifespan. So you're looking at a potential for accidental explosions as being a bigger issue, which can cause these unexplained fish die-offs that suddenly appear on Nova Scotia's coast, and everybody's saying, oh, it's warmer waters and whatnot. But it might have been just an underwater explosion that killed a big school of fish that happened to be in the area. So anyway, the specific ordinance, I don't know I can necessarily say. I know people that can give me the answer. But in terms of the actual depth charge itself, as it biodegrades, I assume it takes on a number of danger categories, a number of risk categories. I do know that in some cases, throwing ordnance in the ocean might have actually been the best way of disposing of some of these munitions. So, for example, phosgene is really high soluble. So putting it into water, it was going to just dissolve almost instantly. And the only dangerous byproduct is that it creates hydrochloric acid, which adds to ocean acidification, but in a localized area. So, like I said, I'm not a chemist, but there will be breakdown chemicals and breakdown byproducts that pose significant energy problems. For example, mustard gas, when it biodegrades, I believe it's mustard gas, it can create arsenic, which is the big thing that they've been monitoring. So, sure, let's go to the front first. I'll get to you guys in the back.
Okay, thank you.
One of the maps you showed had almost the whole coast of Nova Scotia circumnavigated with red dots. About how far off coast did they go out for the closer of the dumps?
So there, as far as I could tell, there were no like set, oh, we have to be this many kilometers from shore. There were those types of regulations set up for like atomic waste and other things like that. But in the case of weapons, they didn't really pay much attention to that. It was more of like, okay, we're out of view of the harbor master, let's start jettisoning stuff. And then they would just keep jettisoning it on their route towards the dump site.
I know we went out to what was called spoil ground.
Yeah, it's probably the Emerald Basin.
I guess you can still see the coast. It might have been 40 miles. It wasn't very far, but it was a designated, it was marked on the chart with a dotted line, and it was used for dumping, but it was used for dumping all sorts of stuff.
Yeah, that was the first place that they chose. I think the place you're referring to is the Emerald Basin. I think that's what it's officially called. And that is where when they were going through after the Halifax, or the other Halifax explosion, they just said, okay, everything in this vicinity is considered destroyed and let's just get rid of it as quickly as possible. And there were some depth charges that actually were there that were building up in gas inside that they had to move really quickly. So in this sense, they just said, okay, where's the closest dumping ground? And they looked at a map and they said, okay, it's right here. All right, let's put everything there as quickly as possible. So, like I said, it's this idea that they knew what they were dumping was like dangerous and contaminating, and their logic was, okay, let's put it where we've already put other dangerous contaminating stuff, and it kind of builds over time as the precedent is created.
Yeah, you had mentioned something about lots of dumping in the Great Lakes, and Parry Sound was a great dump site. Freshwater versus saltwater. How does that vary the decomposition?
It's slower in freshwater, so the danger might be more elongated. That's the main difference. There's also, I think, water temperature plays a role as well in corrosion. But the Great Lakes were used for dumping ordnance. Usually, the records that I found involve unexploded ordnance being found on land. You know, somebody had a grenade that was, you know, in their house, or, you know, there was a bomb that was in their backyard that had been a bombing range at one point in time. They panic, they call the RCMP, the RCMP comes by, picks up the thing, and they wait until there's enough ordnance that's amassed before dumping becomes financially viable. And then they go out into somewhere in the Lake Ontario. I don't have records on where the actual location was, but I know that the munitions were held in the Queenston Quarry, and then in June of 1946, the batch that I was tracing was jettisoned into the Lake Ontario. And it's actually, like, if you live in the Nobel area, you're in the middle of the scar of the Second World War, like a huge scar. That's like the second or third largest explosives plant in the entire British Empire was located there. And when they came in to clean up, they had only so much money that they could clean up the stuff with. And so under that context of financial constraints and the pressing needs to downgrade and demobilize and send your expertise to civilian life, they had to adopt crude methods. So they open air burned a lot of the stuff. And then what they couldn't burn, they put onto a barge and just sent out into the Parry Sound and into the Georgian Bay. Yeah, wow is right.
Yes. The authorities must have, or must be doing decomposition projections. How long does it take before mustard gas and TNT and stuff degenerate to a point where it's sort of relatively inert, or you know, and is there a program to go and study something like an Alka-Seltzer for all this stuff that's coming out of these shells as they degrade, to try and sort of mitigate the decomposition or the poisons?
Okay, in terms of the second part of your question, I don't know if there's a program in Canada to do that. I would suspect the RMC has a program in their like chemical or explosive unit, and I have met some people that are working there and that are studying underwater munitions. So I imagine that if you wanted to get involved in that, you'd have to go to the RMC. I don't know of any university in Canada that's looking at this particular issue. In terms of your first part of your question, though, it's interesting that you brought up TNT and mustard gas because those are actually the two biggest problems. Mustard gas is not soluble, so it doesn't hydrolyze very quickly. And in fact, in cold water, it develops a thin membrane over the outside of it, almost like an egg. And so the gas stays perfectly good and pristine inside that crust, so it doesn't biodegrade. And so in that process, it takes a lot longer. And they pose a serious threat in terms of leaking out of the drums, and then it can float on shore. And there are numerous cases around the world of this stuff, especially fishermen catching mustard gas, and the nets will like crack the shell, and then everybody on deck gets gassed. And then in terms of TNT, TNT is short for trinitryl toluene, which toluene is like the substance that you put on your fingernails with for nail painting and things like that. It's got many applications and things like that. But trinitryl toluene, when it biodegrades, it turns into dinitryl toluene. And DNT is actually a really known and persistent carcinogen that's usually associated with the plastics industry. It's one of those bad plasticky byproducts from the industry. And so actually as TNT biodegrades, it gets worse, though the energetic threat starts to lessen a little bit. So it actually becomes a little bit more carcinogenic over time. And unfortunately, most of the scientific studies that are being done right now are focused on chemical weapons. Chemical weapons are like the weapons of mass destruction. They're recoverable. We need to know more about the stuff that's on the bottom of the ocean. So a lot of that information and expertise is devoted towards chemical weapons. And as one of the scientists at this workshop I was at pointed out, he's like, we know virtually nothing about TNT, even though it was dumped over a vaster area, and it's highly toxic, which means that it can, or it's highly lipophilic is the term he used. So it can pierce the cell membrane and mutate the cell, which causes cancer. So it's a very, very dangerous substance to handle and as it biodegrades in the environment.
And no one has any projection
how
long this is going to take? 200, 300 years?
I've heard of a mixed mixed set of numbers. And I don't feel necessarily comfortable giving you a projection because there seems to be no general agreement. I would say that you're looking at about 100 years for metal casings to corrode, and then you're looking at the stuff corroding, in the wake of that. But the point of the matter is that each dump site is unique, and each dump site has its own metrics and things like that, which leads to difficult generalizations for the subject. And given the fact that it's like out of sight, out of mind, right? It's you look out at Perry Sound in the Georgian Bay. It's just a beautiful location. You don't think that there's something dangerous under there. So it's kind of hard to mobilize knowledge towards this particular endeavor. So anyway, hopefully I answered your question. So.
Bit of a strange one, I guess. I spent lots of my early youth in a little place called Whitstable in England.
Oh, that's where I was when I did my research.
You did the oysters, right? In our early days, we had a lot of pollution going up and down the channel, the English Channel. And when the oyster beds were messed up, I think most people thought that it was due to the general pollution of the oceans. Was the dumping kept secret to a large extent? Because you're talking about this as if it's something that should have been known, and the impact on the oysters, which is now gone because they put fresh beds of oysters out there. But the sound of it is there's still some residual stuff there. And we as kids paddled there, so am I going to...
That's a difficult question to answer. So in the first case, in about 1926, they introduced a new species of oyster to deal with more pollution. Because you're right, there was a high amount of pollution. And that was one of the reasons that Dr. Orton couldn't definitively attribute the cancerous lesions to the TNT, right? Because they did all their lab tests. And in the lab tests, all the oysters they tested from the Thames estuary, all of them were dead within 9 days. a 10 parts per million solution of TNT. And all of them were dead. And he still concluded that it was inconclusive because the lab conditions couldn't account for the conditions in the Thames estuary, right? And so lab tests were one answer, but it couldn't account for something else. And that was the big thing that they kept bringing out. Oysters were dying in places where dumping hadn't taken place. So that was one of the situations that the government capitalized on, because the oyster merchants were gearing up to make a large war claims settlement. So that, right, this idea that if your property was damaged during the war, you could apply to a claims tribunal and get reparations, essentially. And so the government was able to bypass the deadline by drawing out some of these scientific studies in order to ensure that mainly they didn't have to pay out a big sum to these oysters. And then in the end, I think I'm actually, some of this research in this specific case is actually a work in progress. I'm actually writing an article on the subject. So I haven't made it through necessarily all of the evidence that I've collected. But as far as I know now, the munitions haven't been cleaned up. They're still there. And what they've just done is sort of remade the landscapes to better deal with the pollution. And that was in part and parcel with putting new sets of oysters there. That was sort of like their remediation strategy. And in terms of what the public knew, they could see the ships go out, they could see people throwing things in the ocean. There's tons of newspaper accounts about it. As a matter of fact, most of the newspaper accounts are positive. They wanted people to know that they were doing the responsible thing. Right, at the time, you leave it on land, it's going to blow up possibly, or somebody's going to steal it, or it's going to be an occupational hazard. So the point of the matter is getting it off the ledger books as quickly as possible was the responsible thing to do. And so that idea here is that most of the newspaper articles are positive in that regard. Though in the wake of some of these issues, and depending on the political leanings of the newspaper, you'll get accounts that are a little inflammatory about how TNT is dumped. And actually, if we go back here, just to go to the slide, those are two newspaper articles from the time, in whatever it is, 1920 and 1923, that kind of outline the fact that, this is in the news, people are reading about it, they know about it. It wasn't necessarily done in secrecy, but I can tell you that, the public wasn't informed of numbers, they weren't informed of scale, but they knew it was happening.
This has been another in our series of webcasts produced by the Royal Canadian Military Institute in Toronto as a public educational service. You can find news of upcoming events and links to our webcast archives at www.rcmi.org. On behalf of the RCMI, this is Eric Morse saying goodbye for now and thank you for joining us.